The UK's most powerful farming group lobbied the government to loosen limits on pesticides in drinking water as part of its post-Brexit reforms, according to documents obtained by media. Last July, a senior director of the National Farmers Union, the NFU, met the Earl of Minto, then Minister for Regulatory Reform, to discuss the areas of EU-derived law identified by the farming sector as priorities for reform after Brexit. The list includes key rules on water protection, including those governing levels of pesticides in drinking waters. Thresholds for pesticide residues are tiny, said Nick von Westenholz, the NFU's Director of Strategy, and he told the minister, according to notes of the meeting obtained by media using the Freedom of Information rules. There's no evidence that increasing thresholds would do any harm, he added. The NFU identified the Nitrates Directive, designed to curb agricultural pollution of rivers and other water bodies, among its priorities for replacement. According to the protocol, von Westenholz argued for the rules on when farmers can fertilize their fields to be relaxed, giving farmers more scope to make sensible decisions, as he put it. And he said it could still achieve the same level of protection on watercourses. In a statement shared with media, the NFU disputed the characterization of the meeting as lobbying, describing it instead as explaining the organization's publicly held positions. The group also said it was calling for smarter regulation, not deregulation. When the UK left the EU, it copied over 6,700 EU-derived laws onto its rulebook. It's now engaged in a process of identifying which of these laws can be reformed or scrapped under the retained EU Law Act. Under the Act, ministers can change or revoke EU-derived laws with limited parliamentary approval. These powers expire in June 2026. At a select committee hearing in March, Business Secretary Kami Badenoch, who oversees the regulatory reform, said the government was adopting a demand-led approach to identify which laws to reform. The Earl of Minto held meetings with representatives of different sectors last year to gather their views on rules that could be reformed. The Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, the DEFRA, which oversees farming, is responsible for over 1,900 of the laws identified under the REUL process. And the NFU identified 9 pieces of EU-derived legislation as priorities for replacements, as official notes show. These include legislation implementing the Water Framework Directive. That's the centerpiece of European water protection legislation. Reform of the WFD was among the areas that align well with where DEFRA considers there to be opportunity for review. A briefing note prepared for the meeting shows that. So far, none of the EU-derived laws highlighted by the NFU has been reformed or revoked. And Ruth Chambers, senior fellow at the Green Alliance, said, laws that protect people from potentially harmful pesticides and keep pollution out of our rivers should be strengthened for everyone's benefit, not weakened to serve the interests of a few. These revelations reinforce the need for public consultation and an independent watchdog to hold the government to account on its promise not to dismantle environmental protection using so-called Brexit freedoms. The NFU argued that limits on pesticide levels enshrined in the EU's Drinking Water Directive are a burden on farmers and water companies. Meeting notes show this again, and because of the amount they have to invest in systems to meet negligible requirements. The Drinking Water Directive requires that pesticide concentrations in drinking water must not exceed 0.1 micrograms per liter for a single pesticide and 0.5 micrograms per liter for all pesticides. There is no evidence that increasing thresholds would do any harm, is what von Westenholz told the minister, according to the notes. In its statement, the NFU said it questions whether the strict historic limits on pesticide residues in water are based on up-to-date science, and said that these limits can prevent farmers from accessing important products in tackling pests and diseases. The issue of pesticide residues in drinking waters is still being understood, said Dr. Gary Phones, the professor of environmental aquatic chemistry at the University of Portsmouth. The UK's rivers are potentially exposed to thousands of pesticides, which can harm aquatic ecosystems and affect drinking water, and we know what state they are in at the moment. We have identified a number of pesticides using the ChemCatcher passive sampler that continue to be present in water even after treatment, as Phones said. Through removing pesticides from the water can be difficult, and weakening the drinking water standards is not the solution here. Yes, the thresholds are strong, but that's a good thing, as Phones said. The NFU also complained about the EU's Nitrates directive, which requires a code for good agricultural practice, which specifies minimum manure storage capacity and the conditions under which fertilizer and manure can be spread on farmland to limit pollution of rivers. In areas already polluted by nitrates, there are mandatory rules on the quantity and the timing of applying nitrogen fertilizers and manure, including a strict annual limit on the amount of manure that can be spread. More than half of land in England is designated a nitrogen vulnerable zone, and the NFU has been supporting legal challenges to these designations. Farming pollutes more rivers in the UK than sewage, according to an analysis of Environment Agency data by the think tank Onward. Nutrients from fertilizers that washed are the source of around half of the nitrates and a quarter of the phosphorus entering the country's rivers, as the report found. And the NFU called for extra flexibility for farmers, allowing them to be sensible to make decisions as to when to fertilize. How does that fit together? But they say the legislation can be changed to give the farmer more control and still achieve the same level of protection on watercourses. In its statement, the NFU said the well-designed regulation envisaged by the NFU would mean less runoff into the rivers. UK legislation designed to prevent agricultural runoff into rivers has already been weakened following the country's exit from the EU Common Agricultural Policy's cross-compliance rules. These rules forced farmers to create buffer strips to separate agricultural land from water bodies. And this change in policy is not even related to the REUL. Of the 9 priority areas for reform identified by the NFU, 3 relate to pesticides. And during the meeting with the Earl of Minto, the NFU discussed the process for pesticide approval. Von Westenholz, formerly the CEO of the UK's pesticide trade association CropLife, told the minister that British and European farmers have less access to pesticides than most farmers around the world due to the EU's hazards-based approach. The hazards-based approach, also known as the precautionary principle, effectively means refusing to authorize potentially hazardous products unless they are proven safe, whereas the risk-based approach allows for use until the product is proven hazardous. The NFU has previously made a similar argument in written testimony for a 2022 parliamentary inquiry into post-Brexit regulation. Then the union raised concerns that the UK was not doing anything substantially different on pesticide regulations since EU exit, and claimed that removing the minister from day-to-day decisions about implementing regulation could have a transformational impact on the authorization of pesticide and herbicide products. This would reduce the risk of decisions being made for political reasons, as the NFU says. The NFU's public position is that the UK should improve the application of the precautionary principle so that it takes greater account of risk, innovation, and the costs of taking action. And during the meeting, von Westenholz also described the Habitats Directive, which is designed to protect the habitat of threatened species, as obstructive for development for farmers. For some farmers, however, the UK's current environmental standards are looked upon more favourably. Martin Lyons, the CEO of the Nature-Friendly Farming Network, said, "Regulatory standards help to protect our waterways from pollution and agricultural runoff, improve air quality and boost the health of our soils to ensure farm businesses are sustainable into the future as we face the threat of climate change." And according to some who live near Britain's waterways, farmers must do more to tackle pollution. Angela Jones, a wild swimmer and environmental activist from the Wye River, which has suffered nitrogen pollution from nearby intensive poultry farms, said, "We need farms, but we need them to farm in a way that's going to complement the environment and give us the food that we need." And many farmers understand this. A lot of what's happening by the Wye is not farming, it's industry. And she said, "I think it's terrible to suggest weakening water protections. We need to strengthen them. What's going on now is obviously not working. We might have food, but we won't have any nature left." Well, I wouldn't go that far, but you've seen a lot of videos probably on my channel about the condition of certain waterways and in Britain and the coast, etc. And weakening standards is definitely the last thing they need now. And if you want to know more, the next video is here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.